What's up, guys? Justin here with TheSketchUpEssentials.com. So in today's video, you're going to learn everything you need to know about bending, twisting, and deforming objects inside of SketchUp. Let's go ahead and just jump into it. All right, and so in this video, what I want to do is I want to highlight ways that you can create bent and deformed shapes in SketchUp. Now, most of these are going to be with extensions, and I'll talk about why in a second. But one of the things you need to understand when you're working in SketchUp and you're trying to create shapes that do things like bending is it's not always as simple as just taking a piece of geometry and then creating like a rotation, right? If I take the rotate tool right here and I try to bend this, what happens is you've got this kind of like weird pinch point in here, and that's because this geometry needs to kind of move gradually for most bends, right? The object is actually like kind of cut and then bent along whatever shape you're going to go with. And so for that, you need some more advanced tools. Now, when you're creating basic bent shapes, sometimes it is possible to use native tools. Like for example, in its simplest form, if you wanted to create an object that bends right along this surface, right here, you could just use the Follow Me tool. And what the Follow Me tool is going to do is it's going to extrude an object, and it's going to automatically create the way that this object kind of bends around the corners, right? It's taking this profile, it's extruding it to the corner, and it's figuring out what happens when this shape goes around the corner in order to create this bend. In addition, you can also do things like this with curves. So if you had a curved shape like this and you use the Follow Me tool, what this is going to do is it's going to extrude this shape along a curve. And you can see this because my hidden geometry is on, but notice how as this shape goes along, it's kind of bent at each one of the segments in the curve that we extruded it along. So for simple bends and simple deformed shapes, you can use things like the Follow Me tool in order to create those shapes. So you don't always need extensions, but as you start getting more advanced, you kind of need to start using extensions in order to create these shapes. But the first kind of bending I want to talk about is just simple bending and some tools that are good for this. And so like this object right here is a shape that we could extrude along a direction and have a curve, but this one really isn't, right? Because it's not an uninterrupted shape. So if we tried to use the Follow Me function, we wouldn't be able to do that because you wouldn't be able to actually extrude these kind of like in areas like this. And so in order to get a bend in this, you're going to need some bending tools. And so the first tool I want to highlight is an extension from Fredo 6 called Fredo Scale. This is going to have probably the most bending, tapering, shearing, and deformation tools built into it. It's not always the right answer, but it is a really cool tool, and it's got a really good tool for adding bends to objects. And just note that Fredo Scale is a paid extension, and you can either buy the perpetual license for $15, or you can get his bundle, which is usually what I recommend, for $50. It comes with a bunch of other extensions. I don't want to get too far into that right now, but it just has a better collection of tools. But in this case, the tool that I want to highlight from Fredo Scale is this last tool, which is called the Radial Bending tool. And so what the Radial Bending tool is going to do is it's going to allow you to set a base point like this. So say we were to set an endpoint right here, you can set a reference direction. So that's going to be the direction in which you want this to bend. And I want to go ahead and make sure that I've got this right on the very top of this object, so I'm bending it from the middle. So we're going to set a reference direction. We're going to pick a target point, and then notice how as I move my mouse, it's going to bend this object. And you can set the number of degrees that it does this to. So say we wanted to bend this 90 degrees, we could talk about 90, or we could type in 90 and hit the enter key. And notice what that does is that takes this object and it kind of like cuts it up and it bends it along a curve right here. This is really good for objects like this one that are a little bit more complex, and you can't use the typical bending tools in SketchUp like this. So say I wanted to bend this by 125 degrees, it's going to go through, and if you look at it, what it's actually doing, and most of these tools are doing this in one way or another, it's kind of slicing it up and then adding like a gradual bend to each one of the pieces in here. And when you're working with this, there is the option when you're running when you're working with it. If you hit the tab key, you can set the number of slices that it generates. But just in general, that's how all of these tools are going to work. Okay, and so sometimes you want to take an object and you want to bend it more, right? Or you might want to bend it differently. So let's say we wanted to take this object and bend it 360 degrees. Well, Fredo Scale doesn't do that. So if I tried to take this object and bend it 360 degrees, so if I type in 360 right here, notice how it does nothing. So there's another tool when you want to create a bend like that called True Bend. You can download True Bend from the SketchUp extension warehouse right here. And what True Bend does is it bends objects to a certain degree and it preserves the length of the object, but it also gives you the ability to bend an object 360 degrees. So this is a tool from TomTom. And so what True Bend is going to do is it's going to bend an object based on its axis direction. So in this case, what I can do is I can take this object. Notice how I could actually bend this 360 degrees like this. So now I have this like complete spiral in here. So if you need to bend objects like 360 degrees, this is a great tool for that. And so if you want to bend an object along a central point based on kind of a radius off to the side, this is a really good tool for that. The other thing I like about this is it does a really good job of bending it so that it's completely aligned in the middle here. So say that you wanted to take this object and mirror it for whatever reason. If you use True Bend, then these segments are going to line up really well, and you're not going to have any kind of like weird gaps or anything like that. So True Bend is another option. It is free to download. Okay, and so sometimes you want to bend objects along paths, right? You don't just want to add like a single bend in them or something like that. There's an extension from Chris Fulmer in the SketchUp extension warehouse called CLF Shape Bender. You can find it in the extension warehouse. This thing hasn't been updated in forever. Even though it doesn't show that it's compatible with SketchUp 2025, it is still working in SketchUp 2025, so I'm still using it. But basically the way this works is you give it a baseline, which has to be drawn along the red axis, and a target line, and an object. It'll take this object, it'll cut it up, and it'll bend it along this curve right here. So you just select the object, you go to Chris Fulmer Tools and pick Shape Bender, you pick your first line, you pick your second line like this. And then I can just hit the enter key and it's going to bend that along the curve right here. So super powerful for adding things along curves. Now note that the distance from the target line is going to affect the distance, or the distance from the baseline affects the distance from the target line. So if you needed this to be like precisely on this line, you would just have your base object right on this line right here. But I want you to see the edge so you can understand what it's doing. But we're just going to use Shape Bender. We're going to use Shape Bender right here. And notice how you can see that it is segmenting this up based on the segments in the curve right here. And that is something that's worth noting. And I don't know if I can change the number of segments in here. I don't think I can, but maybe if I use the Fredo Spline extension, we're just going to adjust this to be a polyline segmenter. And I'm just going to change this to 128 segments right here. So still a curve, but it's got more segments in it. That Fredo Spline tool is really handy for things like that because the number of segments that are in your target geometry usually matter when you're doing things like this. But now, if I run this, I'm going to click again, and we'll click again right here. Notice how it's going to add a whole bunch more cuts in here like this, but if I hit the enter key, it's going to cut this and smoothly bend it along this curve. So you can use this for a lot of interesting things. Like for example, I've taken this curve right here and I've just moved it off of this base piece right here. But if I have a target line like this, I can use this to bend objects along things like cylinders pretty precisely like this. And note that that tool, if you ever get something that looks like this, you just need to tap the down arrow key to swap the direction that this is going. You might play around with the up arrow key as well, but notice how it takes this object and it bends it along this curve right here. So you could do this with more complex shapes too, if you wanted to. So for bending along paths, Shape Bender is really great. Now, sometimes we want to do something a little bit different. We want to take an object and we want to add a twist to it. And so the best way to add a twist is going to be using a tool inside of the Fredo scale tool set, because like if we try to do this manually, right, if I come in here and I rotate this, notice how it just kind of like crimps the geometry in here. That's because we don't have enough supporting geometry, and it needs to be doing this gradually. We kind of talked about that at the beginning of the video. Well, with the Fredo scale, there's a tool included called box twisting. And what it does is when you select an object and you add a twist to it, notice how it shows you when you mouse over one of these, how many cuts it's going to make. And again, you can hit the tab key in order to adjust this. So say I did like a 24, it's going to give me more cuts in here. But basically you take an object, you set a base direction, and then the number of degrees you want this to twist. So say I wanted this to twist 90 degrees. What this tool does is see how it adds a bunch of slices in here and just rotates this or twists it based on each one of the slices that's in here. So it's a really advanced tool in the sense that it's like slicing this and then just adding a gradual rotation. Now, this can get really fun if you need to do things like create like a twisted bar or something like that. And we'll do this first one with maybe just like 6 segments. And then the second one we'll do with more. But we're going to say we want this to rotate 180 degrees. Well, notice how if I do that with 6 segments, it's going to come in here and it's going to add that gradual rotation. If I do it with, say, 128, slices is too many. We'll do 60, which is the max that this tool is going to do. But if I do 180 degrees right here, notice how it gives me this much smoother twist. So if you need to create things like twisted bars and things like that, that box twisting function is super valuable. And so another kind of deformation that people don't talk about is shearing objects. And so what shearing is taking an object and it's basically adding a deformation to a side, right? And so Fredo Scale has some tools built in that will do this kind of shearing. So what it's going to do is it's basically going to use a box, and then it's going to take the object and add a shear to it based on the box, which I never really use. I really use the other option, but notice how that kind of shears it so that this side goes down and this side goes up. And then there's also a function for this box planar shearing, which is going to allow you to take an object and shear it like this. Now, I rarely use this kind of shearing, but what I use a lot is I use a kind of shearing where you take a curve and you shear it up, right? So what I want is I want to take this curve and I want to move it up on one end so that I have a curve that gradually moves up and down. I do this all the time for landscape type modeling. And so there's another tool from Fredo 6 built into the Fredo tools extension. You can download it from the SketchUpEssentials plugin store. Note that a lot of these, by the way, require you to have libfredo, which is Fredo 6's like support extension of different scripts and stuff. You basically install it as an extension. It works in the background. You can get that from SketchUpEssentials for free. But in this case, Fredo tools can be downloaded for free from SketchUpEssentials. It has a bunch of different tools for doing different things in SketchUp. But the one I probably use the most is called Curvature. And what Curvature does is it allows you to select a curve. So we're going to select these 2 edges right here. We're going to activate Fredo tools. And notice how we've got all these different options, but we want Curvature. And what we can do is we can tell it, okay, we want the top height of this object to be 4 feet. Right? So if I type in 4 feet right here, hit OK, notice what it does is it basically creates a copy of this curve that it's sheared upward. So this is really great for creating ramps and other geometry like that. Now you're usually going to need some kind of a skinning extension like Curveloft or something like that. You could also use Soap Skin and Bubble. Soap Skin and Bubble is free in the SketchUp extension warehouse. Curveloft is included in that Fredo 6 collection of extensions. And so what Curveloft does is it gives you the ability to loft along a shape in order to create a skin. So a lot of the time you're doing kind of like multi-step things, right? You're creating a frame and then you're creating a skin on top of the frame. But if you ever need to create things where you have paths or hardscapes that go from one height to another height, highly recommend Curvature for that. And then sometimes you want to do something even more complex and you want to take an object and you want to deform it across a 3-dimensional surface, right? So in this case, we're talking about taking a shape like this grid, and you actually want it to deform to fit along a surface rather than a singular curve, right? So these are objects that curve in multiple different directions. There's an extension called Flowify that you can download for free from the SketchUp extension warehouse. And what it does is it'll take an object, and what we're doing is we're giving it a base plane. We've got two edges that run to two corners of a quad shape, meaning a shape that has four corners, and then we've got a target set of geometry. Those all go in a group, which is a little bit confusing when people first start working with this tool. I can link to a Flowify tutorial where we talk more about that. But what Flowify is really good for is you can take an object and you can bend it along this multi-directional bending shape. And so you can go to Tools, Flowify, and it'll take this object and it'll actually bend and deform it along this shape right here. Now you get this kind of like nasty looking geometry. Don't worry about that because you can just go over into the soften edges function. Usually you can just check the box for soften coplanar and it'll soften all of those edges, but then you've got kind of a smooth look at this object right here. Now practically speaking, this is really good for if you wanted to bend objects along surfaces like text. So let's say I was to run Flowify now. So Tools, Flowify. See what it does is it takes this object and it's basically splitting it up along a grid. You can see the grid that gets placed on your flat shape right here, but it basically slices this object up and then it bends it so that it fits along a surface. So if you want to bend like text along a surface or something like that, it's a really good tool for that. One of the more practical applications I've seen for this is if you have like a slat wall or something like that, and you need it to bend along a surface like this one, this is a good tool for doing that. Now, whenever you're doing something like this, I really recommend that you save before you do this because it is bending a whole bunch of geometry. The other thing is you want to make sure that your base geometry is within this shape. So sometimes I'll kind of like cheat it over just a little bit because if your geometry goes outside of your target box, it can do some weird things on your edges. So I usually like to keep it just a little bit inside of that target shape when I can. But if I take this, and these all need to be grouped together for this to work properly, the grouping is very important. But if I take these objects and I do a Tools, Flowify, and we're going to go ahead and we're going to hide all of this stuff so you can see this. Notice what it did is it took this, and let's go ahead and soften it up right here. But it took this and it bent it so that these shapes actually follow along with that surface right here. Now, if that surface had more geometric detail in it, this would be a smoother bend. So that's definitely something that's worth thinking about when you're initially setting everything up. But it does a really good job of bending that object along that surface like this. So if you need to flow along a surface, definitely check out Flowify. And then the last one of these is probably the most practical, and that is going to be stretching objects. So stretching objects is something that you can actually kind of do using native tools, just depending on the way that you have everything set up. So for example, say I've got this cabinet in here and I've got these cabinet doors. Well, remember that your geometry inside of SketchUp, depending on the way that it's grouped, is sticky geometry. So if you've ever picked up a face or something like that, you might have dealt with this kind of thing. That's not necessarily ideal, but you can make that geometry work for you, because if I take this geometry and select it, so I've basically selected the edges and faces on the two ends of this object, as long as I move them in the green direction, like this, notice how this object is deforming in a way that's actually useful to me. I'm taking this geometry, I'm stretching it out, and all of this other geometry is just kind of stretching along because I've got this selected at kind of a natural point. So I can use the way that I set up my geometry using native tools like this in order to be able to deform objects in a way that actually works for me. You just need to be really careful that you're on axis, because if you like slightly go off of axis, it's going to really mess up your geometry. So you need to be careful with this method, but you can do this just kind of naturally inside of SketchUp if you're careful with the way that you set up your geometry. Now, there are also two tools that I really like for this as well. So one of them is inside of the Fredo scale extension that we talked about before. So what this one is it's called box stretching. What it does is, like right now we can't scale this object because it's going to distort all of our geometry, right? It makes all the edge or the all the styles and rails and face frames and all of that the wrong size. So we can't use the scale tool, but box stretching allows you to set a point. So I can move this over here and I'm gonna click and drag it, and then you can stretch based on that point. So notice how as I do this, this geometry is stretching without actually deforming it. It's basically taking all of the geometry on the right side of that object and just kind of like sliding it over and stretching this object. Now, the cool thing about this one is if you right click on it, there's an option for from center. Well, if you pick from center and then click and drag this, you're able to actually take this object and scale it from multiple locations. So I can mouse over one of these scaling grips right here, and I can scale this in order to resize this object in 2 directions right here. So this can be really valuable for things like cabinets. Now, the only thing I would say about this is I found that one to be a little bit unstable sometimes. Not a lot, but it's definitely something where I would save before I used it just to make sure that everything works the way that it should. But there's another extension from Shearing called Shearing Stretch, and it does something very similar. And I found Shearing Stretch is a little bit more stable, but it doesn't have that like scale in multiple different directions. But what Shearing Stretch does is it allows you to select nested geometry. So like right now, for example, I've got my different parts and pieces of this model in here. Well, I want to select them and stretch them without having to like double click in here and pick up a whole bunch of geometry and stuff like this. Well, if you use Shearing Stretch, what it does is it allows you to select an object, and notice how it picks up all of the vertices inside of your selection. Well, now if I take this, I can set this by length rather than by like a scale ratio, which you have to do with the other tool. So say I wanted to move this over by 6 inches, I just type in a value of 6 inches. It'll take those objects and it'll stretch them over. And then I could do the same thing over here. Just type in a value of 6 inches. And notice how this object will stretch without getting any deformation applied to it. And so this can be valuable for a lot of different things. So say you had a stair like this one, but it was more complex. You could do the same thing over here where you could select the geometry and then move these edges over based on that function. So I really enjoy Shearing Stretch. I think it does a really good job of kind of helping you precisely stretch objects in SketchUp. All right, so that should give you a pretty good idea of some of the bending and deforming options available for SketchUp. Leave a comment below. Let me know if you're using any of these. I just love having that conversation with you guys. If you do want to check them out, you can check out my Ultimate Extensions Guide. You can just go to TheSketchUpEssentials.com/extensions, and I've got a massive list of extensions where I link to tutorials on how to use them, where to find them, everything like that. But as always, thank you so much for taking the time to watch this, and I'll catch you in the next video. Thanks, guys.